It is Sunday, the 2nd April 2017. I'm just starting up my alternative spiritual practice of protesting outside the Unitarian Church of Montreal against a variety of Unitarian Universalist injustices, abuses, and hypocrisy, which include, but are by no means limited to, the anti-religious intolerance and bigotry that is still apparently alive and well amongst the atheist faction of Unitarian Universalists. And I even say there's a certain amount of anti-religious intolerance and bigotry on the part of, shall we say, the Christian faction as well, in terms of, anti-other religions to some extent. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of clergy misconduct, both sexual and non-sexual. On the clergy sexual misconduct front, just last week, I can't remember the exact day, but sort of in the last week of March, the head, or I think the executive director of the Unitarian Universalist Christian Fellowship, or Christian Unitarian Universalists, Reverend Ron Robinson in Oklahoma, was arrested on charges of essentially, viewing and downloading child pornography of quite a bad type. It's all bad, but we're talking here, I think, from the sound of it, sadistic stuff. So, if you were to Google, Reverend Ron Robinson in the Google News, or just Google, ordinary Google, you'd find more information about that. So, we're going to continue this, but, one of my picket signs over here speaks of the Church of the Image Tarnishing Ministers. It just got blown down by the wind, which seems to be emanating from the Unitarian Church of Montreal, but I think it's especially appropriate today, this one, in terms of the most recent addition to the number of image tarnishing ministers that the Unitarian Universalist religious community has. This sign originally said Church of the Image Tarnishing Minister, and it specifically referred to Reverend Ray Drennan, the previous settled minister, or perhaps not so settled, depending upon what the meaning of the word settled is, minister of the Unitarian Church of Montreal. But as you can see, I pluralized it, and I pluralized it because since Reverend Ray Drennan retired, I would say that in some ways, Reverend Diane Rollert, the minister who replaced him, has also to some extent tarnished the image of the Unitarian Church of Montreal at the local level. But then I just decided to broaden out what this picket sign slogan refers to. The church can be broadened out to the whole Unitarian Universalist religious community, not just the Unitarian Church of Montreal. That brings in a whole lot more image tarnishing ministers into the picture. Ministers like, pretty much any minister who's charged, tried, and convicted of such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape, as a certain number of Unitarian Universalist ministers have been. Ministers who were guilty of tarnishing the image of Unitarian Universalism in various other ways. Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein, also known as Peace Bang, certainly comes to mind. One of the most offensive and rude Unitarian Universalist ministers you're ever going to find online. She just continuously insults and defames people. Anyhow, we shall get out of the way here. Some people walking by. Hey, sir. So I guess they're heading off somewhere else. So, let's see, what picket signs are we going to display in the hands this morning? We're going to keep this one here. Unitarian Universalist misuse blasphemy law to cover up and deny such despicable crimes of pedophilia and rape. Well, we'll save that one. Atheist UUs are accusing me of blasphemy. Well, yeah. UU liars bear false witness against me. Well, let's play that, I must say. I think we're going to be talking, a fair bit, though, about Reverend Ron Robinson today. Oh, and also UUA President Reverend Dr. Peter Morales. This is the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and he can certainly be numbered amongst those Unitarian Universalist ministers who tarnish the image of Unitarian Universalism. In fact, he kind of tarnished the image of Unitarian Universalism last week by resigning less than 3 months away from completing his second term as UUA minister. I mean, couldn't he just hack it out for another 2.5 months and step down without causing a controversy by resigning? Personally, I think he should have resigned years ago after falsely accusing me of the criminal act of blasphemous libel and legal bullying intended to cover up and hide such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers. I mean, that is a seriously immoral, unethical, borderline criminal, and quite frankly, batshit crazy behavior on the part of Reverend Dr. Peter Morales and other top-level UUA leaders, but he didn't have the personal integrity required to withdraw the false accusation and apologize, to say nothing of resign. In fact, I had intended to give him another opportunity to retract that accusation and apologize and even resign. Basically, in the last few months, there are 3 female candidates to be the next UUA president. One of them will be elected in June, so we're only, we're less than 3 months away from a new UUA president. So in a way, just as UUA President Peter Morales did in fact resign last week over a different issue, it wouldn't have hurt really that much for him to resign over misusing blasphemy law to hide pedophilia and rape, and basically his dismal track record in terms of other issues, such as dealing responsibly with all forms of clergy misconduct. His administration has sort of gone through the motions to some extent of ostensibly reforming the policies and procedures for dealing with clergy sexual misconduct. There's been some changes, but I'm not convinced that the changes are really significant progress. And the problem with the policies and procedures for dealing with clergy misconduct is that they're rarely enforced anyway. Like, the UUA leadership find all kinds of excuses for not enforcing the flawed policies that are in place. The flawed policies that are in place could nonetheless be more strictly enforced and better enforced, and there could have been better justice for victims of all kinds of clergy misconduct within the existing flawed policies and procedures. But essentially there's no political will, as it were, on the part of the UUA to really hold ministers accountable when they behave badly and subject them to any serious discipline. It's extremely rare for a Unitarian Universalist minister to face any kind of serious discipline for clergy misconduct, whether it's non-sexual or sexual. In fact, my understanding is that in the 55 or so year history, well, now I guess it's 56, coming up for 56 years of existence of the Unitarian Universalist Association. So we're limiting this to the Unitarian Universalist Association when Unitarian Church and the Universalist Church merged in 1961. We're not going back before that. Just the last 55 years. In that time period, no less than 400 Unitarian Universalist churches were affected by one form of clergy sexual misconduct or another. So this has nothing to do with non-sexual misconduct. This is purely sexual misconduct, which is really the only kind of misconduct that the UUA even bothers to concern itself with, except for the odd occasion when a Unitarian Universalist minister plagiarizes his fellow ministers. Well, though that's serious non-sexual misconduct, but forget about it when a Unitarian Universalist minister abuses, verbally and psychologically abuses, slanders and libels a congregant. Oh, well, that's no big deal. But if a Unitarian Universalist minister plagiarizes the sermons of his fellow ministers, oh, well, that's a serious crime, because after all, it was committed against other Unitarian Universalist ministers. But getting back to the issues here, in terms of policies and procedures, for all his empty talk, Peter Morales himself did remarkably little to improve things. And in fact, on his watch, it does seem that, some cases of clergy sexual misconduct were badly handled by his own administration. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of his administration misusing Canada's blasphemy law and clergy sex abuse cover-up legal bullying. But getting back to the whole reform issue, the new-ish moderator of the UUA, Jim Key, he basically presented himself as the knight in shining armor who was going to come and clean up the mess and make sure that the policies and procedures were thoroughly revamped and significantly improved and so on. Well, I see very little evidence, as I said, of any significant improvement. And as I said, no matter how much they improve the policies and procedures on paper, there's the whole issue of no matter how good they are on paper, the staff at the UUA who handle clergy misconduct complaints have this habit, shall I say, culture of, got a nice honk there, and a thumbs up, they have this, essentially this culture, dare I say rape culture. I mean, that's maybe taken a little too far, but then again, maybe not. Depends upon what the meaning of the word rape is, but they have this culture of dismissing all manner of complaints against Unitarian Universalist ministers. They just find some excuse to do nothing, or very, very little. And it's been going on forever. So no matter, even if the policies and procedures are absolutely perfect, completely flawless in terms of how they're written down and committed to paper, that wouldn't necessarily change the culture of finding excuses to pretend the minister has done nothing wrong, finding ways to diminish responsibility and so on, continuing to intimidate and harass people who complain about clergy misconduct and so on. So anyway, Jim Key, he presented himself as this champion of victims of clergy sexual misconduct, but there's some very, very telling failures on his part that really call into question his sincerity. And that is just the fact that, as I've said, the few changes that actually have been made are, I think, comparatively minor. Nothing really terribly significant. And one of the glaring flaws, which I pointed out formally to the UUA during the April 2010 UUA Board of Trustees meeting, so almost 7 years ago now. We're talking about around the 20th the 22nd or so of April of 2010. It's now the beginning of April 2017, so just under 7 years ago, during the UUA Board of Trustees meeting, which I attended as a public witness, I made it very, very clear to the UUA Board of Trustees and also to the Reverend Dr. Peter Morales UUA administration that, you know, there was a very serious flaw in the policies and procedures for dealing with clergy sexual misconduct, in that there was absolutely no appeal process for victims of clergy misconduct whose complaints were, you know, either dismissed or, you know, not handled in a way that they consider to be truly just and equitable and so on. There's like zero way for them to appeal what they consider to be a bad decision in a clergy misconduct complaint. And that's one of the reasons why UUA administrators, you know, essentially happily dismissed all kinds of complaints and happily, you know, did the absolute minimum in terms of disciplining the ministers, because they knew perfectly well there was no way for the victims and complainants to appeal. You know, if there'd been an appeal process, they might have been less inclined to just dismiss stuff and pretend nothing was wrong and so on, because, you know, they could then go to the next level and they might not come out of it looking too good, you know, if they were found to have made a bad decision. So this was like 7 years ago almost that I said to the UUA, you know, there's no appeal process whatsoever for clergy misconduct complainants in the policies and procedures of either the Ministerial Fellowship Committee or the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association.